Jan Michael Frank, who became known as the Butcher of Poland, was a German lawyer and politician affiliated with the Nazi Party who served directly under the orders of the dictator Adolf Hitler. Frank remained at the head of the general government until its collapse in early 1945. On October 1st, 1946, in Nuremberg, Germany, after more than 10 months of trial, 21 defendants among the most important political, military and economic leaders of Nazi Germany heard the reading of their sentences. This was only the first of many war crimes trials held after the Second World War, and it would become a warning to war criminals and dictators around the world. As the horrors of German atrocities were revealed, especially against the Jews, 12 of the 21 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Frank was convicted of crimes against humanity and was hanged on October 16, 1946. His final moments on the gallows are shocking. Prepare yourself. Jan Michael Frank was born on May 23, 1900 in Karlsruhe, then part of the German Empire. He was the second of 3 children of Karl, a successful lawyer, and Magdalena, the daughter of a prosperous banker. At the age of 10, his mother left the family to live with a lover in Prague, an event that deeply marked his childhood. Frank grew up in Munich, where he studied at the Maximilians Gymnasium at the age of 17. During the First World War, he enlisted in the German army but did not serve on the front lines. With the end of the war in November 1918 and during the German Revolution, he joined the Freikorps, paramilitary units composed of war veterans. In these troops, he participated in the repression of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, a short-lived socialist government established in the region. The Freikorps fought communists and other groups considered responsible for the German defeat. During this period, Frank was also involved with the Thule Society, an occultist group founded in Munich that influenced the creation of the German Workers' Party. In 1919, he joined the DAP, which in February 1920 became the Nazi Party, the NSDAP. However, it was not until September 1923 that Frank joined the SA, the Nazi paramilitary force known as the Brown Shirts. The SA actively participated in the Beer Hall Putsch in November 1923, a failed coup attempt led by Adolf Hitler and his allies to overthrow the German government. The goal was to march on Berlin and initiate a national revolution, but the uprising was quickly suppressed by the Munich police. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed in the clash. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he served only 8 months. Frank, for his part, fled to Italy, where he learned Italian, returning to Munich in 1924 after the charges against him were dropped. On April 2, 1925, Frank married Brigitte Gerbst, a stenographer for the Bavarian State Parliament. Brigitte, who wished to secure a stable future before turning 30, saw in Jan Frank, a young lawyer from a wealthy family, an opportunity for social advancement. However, the marriage was tumultuous, as Frank had difficulty asserting himself before his wife. Together, they had 5 children between 1927 and 1939, including Nicholas Frank. Brigitte often used the children to manipulate her husband, frequently reminding him, "Hans, I gave you 5 children." In 1929, Hitler appointed Frank as his personal legal advisor and head of the legal department of the Nazi Party. As the Nazis gained strength, Frank acted as the party's lawyer in more than 2,400 cases, frequently clashing with other jurists. The rise of Nazism was driven by strong propaganda that portrayed Hitler as a charismatic leader. Frank, a key figure in the party's legal structure, played a crucial role in this process, helping to consolidate Nazi power in Germany. The rise to power of the Nazi Party began in 1930, when it obtained 107 seats in the German parliament, the Reichstag. Jan Frank became one of its members, and with Adolf Hitler's ascent to power in January 1933, his influence grew rapidly. In April of that same year, he was appointed Minister of Justice of Bavaria, a position he held until December 1934. He was then promoted to Reich Minister without portfolio in the government of the Reich. Also, in 1933, Frank assumed the post of Reich leader responsible for legal affairs, becoming the second highest political position within the Nazi Party. In 1934, Frank became one of the 3 judges of the Supreme Court of the Nazi Party, a body created by Hitler in 1925 to resolve internal disputes. Despite being a firm supporter of Nazi ideology, Frank opposed extrajudicial killings, such as those at the Dachau concentration camp and during the Night of the Long Knives, arguing that such actions weakened the legal system. He maintained that the role of judges was to protect the order of the racial community, prosecute elements considered dangerous, and interpret laws according to Nazi principles. In April 1936, during a conference in Rome, Frank met Benito Mussolini, with whom he developed a cordial relationship. He spoke Italian fluently, which allowed him to communicate directly with the dictator. In September of that same year, he traveled again to Italy to deliver a personal invitation from Hitler to Mussolini to visit Germany. When Mussolini accepted the invitation, Frank acted as his advisor during the official visit. On the nights of November 9th and 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht took place, a wave of violence against Jews in Germany and the occupied territories. The SA and German civilians looted thousands of Jewish businesses and homes, burned hundreds of synagogues, and sent about 30,000 Jews to concentration camps. This event marked the transition from anti-Semitic legislation to violent and systematic persecution. Despite her previous business ties with Jews, Brigitte Frank, wife of Hans Frank, showed no empathy toward those seeking help to flee the Nazi regime. The Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland. Shortly afterward, on September 17th, the Soviet Union also invaded the country, and by the end of the month, both regimes had divided Polish territory. The central part of Poland became the general government, an administrative entity under German control. In October 1939, Hitler appointed Hans Frank as Governor-General of this region, seeing him as someone who would not cause problems for the implementation of Nazi policies. Upon receiving news of his appointment, Frank returned to his villa in Berlin and announced to his wife, Brigitte, "You will be the Queen of Poland." He regarded the territory as a colony of the Reich, declaring that Poles were to be reduced to the condition of slaves of the German Empire. Although he was the most important administrator of the general government, his decisions were frequently overruled by the SS and the police, who were responsible for implementing racial policies. Frank, although he did not disagree with the regime's objectives, resented SS interference in his domain. When he questioned Heinrich Himmler about the construction of a concentration camp in Poland, he received a blunt response. "That is none of your business." Hitler wanted the general government to be used as a racial dumping ground, an inexhaustible source of slave labor, and a place for the mass extermination of European Jews. The general government had a total population of 12 million, of whom 1.5 million were Jews. After the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, Eastern Galicia was annexed to the general government, increasing the population by about 3 to 4 million people. Frank never had full control over the general government, since the region was viewed as a zone of military activity. The SS and the Reich Main Security Office, headed respectively by Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, as well as the secret police, the Gestapo, had significant jurisdictional oversight over many matters in Poland. In fact, any assessment of Frank's responsibility for the level of violence and death that characterized the region during the Second World War must take into account that he was often not the person responsible for deciding or supervising such actions. The SS, in particular, were an independent force within the general government and were completely outside Frank's control. Indeed, the governor and Himmler had multiple disputes in the early 1940s over the excessive authority possessed by the SS and police forces and their complete disregard for any form of rule of law or standard judicial procedure. Finally, these tensions reached their peak in 1942 in a direct confrontation between Frank and the effective head of the SS in the general government, Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger. After Frank complained that Krüger simply ignored him and acted as if the SS had no obligation to include Frank's administration in their decisions and actions, the outcome, when reported in Berlin, showed exactly how limited Frank's authority was. Hitler supported the SS, and although Frank remained governor of the general government, he was stripped of the vast majority of his other posts in Germany. Someone in Frank's position as head of the Nazi government in Poland must have experienced a series of fluctuating emotions during the early years of the Second World War. After the rapid conquest of Poland, Hitler waited until the spring of 1940 before launching an equally rapid conquest of Denmark and Norway. Weeks later, Germany invaded the Low Countries and France, conquering Western Europe in a lightning campaign that lasted only 6 weeks. However, Great Britain remained independent despite an intense bombing campaign initiated in the summer of 1940 intended to force its surrender. A year later, Frank was in command of Poland while a massive concentration of troops took place in the region in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union. At first, Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the initial invasion of Russia, progressed well, and by late autumn 1941, the Germans threatened to take Moscow and Leningrad. The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, even considered the possibility of ceding vast expanses of territory to Germany as part of a peace agreement. However, the winter of that year changed everything. The German advance stalled and thousands of soldiers died in the brutal Russian winter. Perhaps as events became more uncertain, Frank began to wonder whether the general government might one day see Russian troops advancing toward Berlin. The Nazis' approach toward the Jewish people had intensified over the years. Although Hitler and his followers had always displayed fierce anti-Semitism after coming to power in 1933, they generally favored a strategy of pressuring the 500,000 Jews of Germany to leave the country, persecuting them through a series of measures known as the Nuremberg laws. As we have seen, Frank supported shaping German laws in this way to align them with the party's racial ideology. Poland was home to approximately 3.5 million Jews when Germany invaded in 1939. This was a population too large to simply force to leave the country, and for a time, plans were seriously considered for the forced deportation of the Jews of Eastern Europe to the Middle East or to the African island of Madagascar, while Frank administered this population in southern and eastern Poland. However, throughout 1940 and early 1941, while the war effort seemed to be going well for the Nazis, a more sinister plan began to develop. To this day, there is disagreement about exactly when the so-called final solution, which the Nazis called the Jewish question, was decided upon, but it is clear that it was sometime in late spring or early summer 1941, while plans for the invasion of Russia were being finalized. At that time, measures were implemented so that the Einsatzgruppen, who had already been involved in the mass murder of Polish political and cultural elites in 1939 and 1940, would advance alongside the German army into the Soviet Union, exterminating Jewish communities in their path. At the same time, the first steps were taken toward the development of extermination centers in some of the dozens of concentration camps that the Nazis had built throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Now, the plan was that Jews from parts of Europe already under Nazi occupation, approximately half of whom were in the territory governed by Frank as part of the general government, would be identified, detained, and sent to these specific camps where they would be murdered en masse. This new plan was communicated to more than a dozen senior Nazi officials at a conference held in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee on January 20, 1942, including Joseph Müller, State Secretary of the General Government and Frank's right-hand man. It was the beginning of the Holocaust of the Jews of Europe. Under Frank's rule, the region administered by the General Government became the central focus of the Holocaust of the Jews of Europe. Although there were dozens of concentration camps established by the Nazis throughout Europe, and all of them involved some level of death and brutality, the Holocaust was carried out in 6 major extermination camps that were built specifically for this purpose, with facilities for mass murder and crematoria to burn the bodies afterward. Of these extermination camps, 4, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor and Belzec, were located within the territory of the General Government, while Auschwitz-Birkenau was located just beyond the border in the part of Poland that had been directly annexed to the Third Reich. Only Chelmno, in western Poland, was significantly distant from the General Government. The level of killing in these camps was staggering. Treblinka was responsible for the death of 800,000 people, most of them Jewish. In Belzec, 600,000 people were murdered, while 250,000 perished in Sobibor and at least 80,000 in Majdanek. If we consider the more than 1 million people murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the total number of deaths in the 5 camps located within or adjacent to the territory of the General Government in Poland exceeds 3 million. These camps were administered by the SS independently of Frank's administration in Krakow. However, this does not mean that the local civil government was not involved. Much of what Frank's administration effectively did during those years was to facilitate the identification of Jews and other people considered enemies of the state, detain them, and ensure their transport to the extermination camps, where most were killed a few hours after their arrival, asphyxiated in gas chambers. In fact, Frank's regime had already deliberately implemented policies intended to murder the Jewish population within the borders of the General Government even before the adoption and implementation of the final solution. For example, there was a conscious effort to deprive Jews in particular of essential resources in the region administered by Frank, notably food, but also basic items such as coal. The idea was potentially to kill thousands of Jews by starvation or by leaving them to freeze to death. This was mass murder by deprivation, all overseen by Frank's administration from Wawel Castle in Krakow. The epicenter of these combined efforts to persecute the Jews of the General Government and prepare them for transport to the extermination camps was the Warsaw Ghetto. Before the war, the city of Warsaw had a huge Jewish population, and some parts of the city were essentially Jewish enclaves, where Jews constituted between 80% and 90% of the population. This number grew during the German invasion of 1939 as Jewish communities fled eastward, seeking refuge in Warsaw before the advance of the German army there. Frank's regime, together with the SS and other security services, quickly imposed a form of martial law. Once Poland was fully occupied, Jews were forced to wear a white armband, and all Jewish businesses had to display a Star of David over their entrances. In early 1940, food ration coupons were introduced, and the resources entering the city were drastically reduced. In April, Frank's administration began building a wall around the Jewish district, which was officially transformed into a ghetto. In November 1940, more than 400,000 people were effectively confined inside an open-air prison. In 1941, a systematic policy of starvation was initiated, with Jews receiving only about 200 calories of food per day. By 1942, the ghetto had become a swamp of disease, hunger, and death. Although the inhabitants, Jews, managed to maintain some form of normal life and culture despite the hardships, around 100,000 Jews died under those conditions. Then came the deportations, mainly to Treblinka. Between the summer of 1942 and Yom Kippur at the end of September of that year, more than 250,000 people were transported from the ghetto to the extermination camps. However, in this initial phase of the implementation of the final solution, many still did not know where they were being taken. In the following weeks, the signs became ominous. And even with the drastic reduction of the ghetto's population, those who remained began to organize a resistance movement known as the Jewish Combat Organization, led by the 24-year-old Mordecai Anielewicz. Supported by the Polish resistance, which smuggled weapons to them, they began preparing to resist further deportation attempts carried out by the SS and Frank's administration between late September 1942 and January 1943. Then, when the Germans re-entered the ghetto in January with the objective of liquidating it in the following weeks, the Jews launched an uprising. Despite being trapped and facing the power of the Nazi war machine, around 1,000 Jewish fighters managed to wage a guerrilla war against the Germans, mainly SS commando troops, for 3 months, until thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers were sent to crush the ghetto uprising on the eve of the Jewish Passover on April 19, 1943. After that, the ghetto was effectively liquidated, and the remaining 35,000 occupants who were not murdered in situ were deported to extermination camps. It was through such measures that the Holocaust was carried out in the general government under Frank's rule. The increasing brutality observed in parts of Nazi-occupied Europe, such as Poland, occurred in direct parallel with the change in Germany's fortunes on the battlefield. After the German advance was halted at Leningrad and Moscow in the winter of 1941, the Russians were able to use that time to expand their war production and recruit many more soldiers. In 1942, they began to push the Germans back, and a decisive confrontation in the city of Stalingrad during the autumn and winter of that year resulted in a Russian victory. From there, the Soviets launched an offensive that expelled the Germans from Russia and forced them to retreat toward Frank's general government in Poland. Meanwhile, in December 1941, the United States entered the war alongside Great Britain and Russia. With a torrent of new soldiers and war material, the Allies managed to achieve victory over Italy and Germany in the North African campaign in early 1943, and invaded Sicily to open a southern front that summer. A western front soon followed in the summer of 1944, when France was invaded and rapidly liberated. Thus, by 1943, it should have been clear to high-ranking Nazi officials like Frank that unless Germany developed some revolutionary weapon, such as the nuclear bomb they were trying to build, the war would inevitably end in German defeat and the fall of the Third Reich. As the war effort turned fatally against Germany, the level of agitation and resistance within Poland and the territory of the general government grew proportionally. There had always been a large resistance movement in Poland, supported by a government in exile in London. But from 1943 onward, this movement began to receive increasing supplies from the Soviets as they advanced westward, entering Ukraine and eastern Poland. These resistance movements were unified under the banner of the Polish secret state, which began assassinating hundreds of Germans in the area of the general government. Then, in late 1943, they began planning an assassination attempt against Frank, inspired in part by the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. the acting governor of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in what is now the Czech Republic, which had taken place in early summer 1942. They acted on January 29, 1944, when a bomb was placed on a train on which Frank was traveling from Krakow to Lwów, the largest city in the Ukrainian part of the eastern territory of the general government. The bomb detonated beneath the train 22 kilometers from Krakow at 11:17 at night, ripping off the rear axle of Frank's car. Although the train derailed, he emerged unharmed. The next day, he continued his journey by plane, flying at low altitude under terrible weather conditions. By Frank's order, Polish prisoners were executed in retaliation, and security measures were tightened throughout the general government. The assassination attempt was only a prelude to the emergence of much more intense resistance. In the spring of 1944, the Polish secret state began preparing for a major uprising against the German occupation, while the Red Army advanced deeper into Poland. The symbolic focus would be the city of Warsaw, and the goal was to divide German forces between fighting the Russian advance in the east and suppressing the insurrection within the general government in order to ensure the success of the revolt and accelerate the liberation of Poland from Nazi rule. This was not merely impatience. In 1944, with the war entering its final stages, the Nazi regime became especially cruel, seeking to murder as many of its racial, ideological and political enemies as possible before losing control of certain regions. More than 400,000 of the 750,000 Jews of Hungary would be murdered in the span of just 6 months that year, after the Nazis took direct control of the country. Thus, although it was later criticized as a premature uprising, the Polish resistance launched its revolt in Warsaw on August 1, 1944. It would last 2 months, but would ultimately be unsuccessful, as both the Western Allies and the Red Army, the latter being the best positioned to help, failed to provide adequate support to the uprising. This occurred despite the belief of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that it was essential to help Great Britain's Polish allies. Although the Warsaw Uprising failed in the autumn of 1944, the liberation of the general government would not be long in coming. After initial resistance during the autumn months, German defenses in Poland began to collapse in the winter, as Hitler concentrated Germany's military efforts on one last major campaign against the Western Allies in the Ardennes region, in Luxembourg and Belgium, near the Franco-German border. As a result, the general government was largely taken by the Red Army. Between December 1944 and January 1945, there was little left to liberate in Warsaw, as the city had been virtually razed in the weeks following the uprising. By mid-January, Russian troops surrounded Krakow. Frank's wife Brigitte and his children had already departed for Germany in December, and he decided to flee back to the Reich just before noon on January 17th. Air raid sirens had been sounding all morning in central Krakow, and Frank had received news that Russian tanks had broken through the city's outer defenses, so he hastily fled the capital of the general government that he had ruled for more than 5 years. By noon that day, in a convoy of cars with his main administrators, Krakow fell just 24 hours later. Curiously, Frank's offices were full of documents and evidence of his administration's activities that they had neglected to destroy. It was observed that the offices were filled with empty liquor bottles, a common scene in areas the Nazis fled between late 1944 and early 1945. 1945. In the following weeks, Frank returned to Germany, but his destination was not Berlin, but Bavaria, where he had spent much of his career in the 1920s and 1930s. He arrived there in early February and sent a message to Berlin declaring that he was ready to continue serving the regime in any way that was necessary. However, Frank had been stripped of his positions within Germany in 1942, and with the general government now effectively dissolved after the Russian occupation, he no longer held any office or authority. On one occasion, when he attempted to give orders to a subordinate officer, the man simply walked away while Frank was speaking. Thus, the former governor spent the last months of the war as a powerless ex-official. It was in this state of irrelevance that he learned in the first days of May that Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th in Berlin as the Russians advanced toward the city center. His successor, appointed propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, imitated his leader on May 1st, and then German forces surrendered in Berlin. The war officially ended on May 8th, at which point Frank was already in custody. On May 4th, 1945, Frank was captured by American troops in Tegernsee in southern Bavaria. The troops who arrested him were the same ones who had liberated Dachau 5 days earlier and had witnessed firsthand the atrocities of the Nazi regime. After his capture, Frank was forced to walk through a corridor formed by American soldiers, all of whom assaulted him. Frank collapsed under this pressure, unable to bear the idea of even harsher treatment, and attempted suicide when that attempt failed. He tried again, only 48 hours later, unsuccessfully cutting his left wrist. He would later say, "I tried to commit suicide because I sacrificed everything for Hitler, and that man for whom we sacrificed everything left us alone." As his son Nicholas told us, his father tried to kill himself because he did not want to be treated as he had treated others. Brigitte Frank also went through a difficult time. All her friends had abandoned her, and no one wanted anything to do with them. To buy food, she had to sell all her possessions, including jewelry stolen from dead Jews and paintings taken from Krakow. What remained was confiscated. However, she still hoped that her husband would be released and even planned to have another child with him. But instead, Jans Frank was tried at the Nuremberg Trials, which were held against representatives of defeated Germany. Frank faced 3 charges: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. At the beginning of his testimony, Frank declared that he felt terrible guilt for the atrocities committed in the occupied territories. But his defense largely focused on trying to prove that he was not truly responsible, that he had only ordered necessary pacification measures, that the excesses were due to police activities beyond his control, and that he had never known about the activities of the concentration camps. As confirmed by Nicholas Frank, his parents knew everything about the extermination camps during the Nuremberg Trials. Brigitte Frank was visited several times by the Jewish journalist Gaston Ullmann, who wrote daily about the progress of the trial and sometimes brought chocolate for Frank's children. Brigitte mentioned Ullmann in a letter to her husband, saying, "He is Jewish, but I believe he has a human heart." During the trial, Hans Frank converted to Roman Catholicism and claimed to have had a series of religious experiences. He also accused the Allies, especially the Soviets, of their own atrocities during the war, and he, along with Albert Speer, were the only defendants to show any degree of remorse for their crimes. He also said, "I myself, speaking from the depths of my feelings and having lived through the 5 months of this trial, want to say that now, after having obtained a complete picture of all the horrible atrocities that were committed, I am seized by a deep sense of guilt. Those of us who are guilty must pay the price, and he paid it." On October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal declared Jans Frank guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death by hanging. According to the verdict, Frank was a conscious and willing participant in the use of terror in Poland, in the economic exploitation of Poland in a manner that led to the death by starvation of large numbers of people, in the deportation to Germany of more than 1 million Poles as slave laborers, and in a program that involved the murder of at least 3 million Jews. After receiving the death sentence, Frank said, "Death by hanging, I deserved it and I expected it." Frank was executed by United States Army Sergeant John C. Woods, who had no documented experience as an executioner before the war. He is believed to have been deliberately incompetent at his job in order to make the 10 Nazi war criminals he executed that day suffer, as they all died in a slow and agonizing manner. The Nazis, executed by Sergeant Woods, fell from the gallows with an insufficient drop to break their necks, resulting in death by strangulation that in some cases lasted several minutes. In addition, the trapdoor was too small, causing head injuries to several of the condemned as they fell. On October 16, 1946, the day of his execution, Jans Frank was the 5th of the Nuremberg defendants to step onto the platform. He was the only one of the condemned to enter the chamber with a smile on his face after uttering his last words, "I am grateful for the treatment received during my captivity, and I ask God to receive me with mercy." Frank was hanged, but because he fell from the gallows with insufficient force to break his neck, his horrific convulsions lasted 11 long minutes before he died. He was 46 years old. After that, his body was cremated and the ashes scattered in the Isar River. Sergeant Woods later insisted not only that he had carried out all the executions correctly, but also declared that he was very proud of his work. If you feel this video brought you value in any way, please subscribe to the channel. Fasvim series. See you soon.